All right, let's dive right into a full-blown constitutional crisis from the Philippines. This was a massive showdown, a high-stakes battle between the legislature and the judiciary that really tested the absolute limits of power.
So it all kicked off with this one seemingly simple question. Can you actually impeach the same top official, we're talking about the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court here, twice in the same year? Back in 2003, the answer to that question nearly blew the government's whole system of checks and balances wide open.
And you will not believe how fast this all went down. Okay, so on June 2nd, the first impeachment complaint gets filed against the Chief Justice. Fast forward to October 22nd, the House committee dismisses it. But then, get this, just one day later, on October 23rd, a second one is filed. The speed was just stunning, and it set off constitutional alarm bells all over the place.
Now, you'd think the rule book for something this huge would be pretty clear, right? And, on the surface, the Philippine Constitution actually has a very specific rule designed to prevent this exact kind of situation.
And there it is, black and white. No impeachment proceedings shall be initiated against the same official more than once within a period of 1 year. I mean, that sounds pretty straightforward, doesn't it? Case closed, you'd think.
So that's the big mystery, isn't it? If the Constitution has this clear one-year ban, how on earth was a second complaint even a possibility? Where was the loophole? How did this even happen?
Well, the answer and the cause of this entire legal firestorm all boil down to how you define a single, simple word in that clause, the word initiate. Yeah, that's it. What does it actually mean to initiate an impeachment? And here, my friends, is the smoking gun. See, the House of Representatives had quietly changed its own rules. Under the old rules, an impeachment was initiated the second it was filed. Simple, clear. But the new rules changed the game. Suddenly, it was only initiated much, much later in the process, only after a committee actually voted on it. And that one little tweak created the loophole that made this whole crisis possible.
So how did the House defend this? Well, they argued that the Constitution gave them the exclusive power to start impeachments. They basically said the courts had no right to interfere, no business telling them how to interpret their own rules. They called it a political question, something for Congress and only Congress to figure out.
So what in the world is a political question? Think of it like this. It's a problem that the Constitution basically says, hey, this is for the politicians in Congress or the executive branch to solve. Courts, you stay out of it. The House was trying to build a legal wall around its actions to keep the Supreme Court on the sidelines.
But the Supreme Court wasn't having it. They refused to sit this one out. Instead, they pointed to their own power, a power that was deliberately made stronger in the 1987 Constitution for exactly this kind of situation.
And that power is called judicial review. But here's the key part. Under the 1987 Constitution, it's not just a power, it's a duty. The court has an obligation to step in and check if any part of the government has committed a grave abuse of discretion. The court basically said, look, we can't just ignore a potential constitutional violation, even if it's about impeachment.
And to really get why that duty is so important, you have to look at the country's history. This quote from one of the Constitution's framers says it all. This stronger court power was a direct result of the trauma of the martial law period, a time when the political question defense was used over and over to justify abuses of power. The framers wanted to make sure the court could never be silenced like that again.
So how did the Supreme Court crack this initiate puzzle? Well, they used a classic two-step approach. First, they just looked at the plain, ordinary meaning of the word in the Constitution. Then, they dug deep into the historical records to figure out what the people who actually wrote the Constitution originally intended for it to mean.
And boy, did they find what they were looking for. The historical records were crystal clear. The old debate records showed that the framers themselves all agreed that initiate simply meant to file the complaint, the very first step. So the Supreme Court called the new House rule what it was, a legal fiction, just a clever trick to try and change the meaning of the Constitution after the fact.
So, with all that evidence out in the open, the court's verdict was absolutely decisive. That new rule from the House of Representatives, totally unconstitutional.
And the conclusion from that was inescapable. The second impeachment complaint was blocked by the one-year rule. End of story.
In its decision, the court made a really important point. It said that by stepping in, it wasn't trying to act superior to Congress. It was just doing its job, its solemn and sacred obligation to be the referee, and make sure every branch of government, plays by the rules written in the Constitution.
So why do we still talk about this case? What's the big takeaway? Well, it cemented the Supreme Court's role as the final guardian of the Constitution. It made it perfectly clear that no branch of government is above the law, and crucially, it protected impeachment, a powerful tool, from being abused and turned into a weapon for political harassment.
And that really leaves us with a huge question to think about, doesn't it? In our own times of intense political fights, how does a 20-year-old ruling, like this one, continue to protect that delicate balance of power that our entire system of government relies on to survive?